You suck with Slaanesh.
Admit it. Oh, go on, please admit it.
And today I'm going to tell you why. Do your salacious schemes satisfy Slaanesh? Does your depravity appease the Dark Prince? Or does he find your decadence rather demure? Well, don't worry. The Master of Blake Cess in all things is here to look after you. And today we will be diving deep into why you suck with Nakari and the Seducers of Slaanesh as a faction. By the end of this video, you'll be able to handle your Slannesh campaigns with unparalleled finesse. As a disclaimer, this is not a guide for multiplayer. It would take more debauchery than the Palace of Pleasure could contain to explain why you're so terrible at that. My name is Blake, and I bid you my fondest welcome to Blake's Takes, where today I'll be giving you my take on why you're just awful with Slaanesh. Is my take hot or not? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps the channel out. Now let you and I become one, and enjoy the carnal spectacle. There are Epicurean jubilations and hedonistic gratifications for us to both indulge our most profane temptations. Together, we will feast on the delights of this world. But first, a message from our lovely sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. This week's promotional video is brought to you by our very own Professor Death Knight. Over to you, Professor.
Professor Death Knight here with a lesson about Live Arena, the new PvP mode where you can fight against other players in real time. Sounds terrifying? Well, so's going to the dentist. You should still do it. Live Arena has a draft feature where you can pick and ban champions to fight for you. Teamwork. When you win matches, you'll get Live Arena crests towards unlocking special area bonuses, or so I hear. I'm too afraid to try any of this out. Alright class, any questions?
Mr. Death Knight, sir, what do you think about other players being able to ban champions?
I hate it. I wish everybody could play. Back in school, I would always get picked last. This is just like when someone pointed at me and said, "You can't even play and your bones look weird." But you know, rules are rules, so.
Okay, so that makes sense. Will you be competing in the Live Arena then?
The cheer of the crowds, the blood on the sand. No, it's just not for me, thanks.
It's not for you, or is it just because you're terrible at PvP?
Why would you say that?
That's okay, I'm bad at multiplayer too. But you fine folks in the audience don't have to be. If you download Raid and you're a new player, you'll get the Stag Knight, one of the best epic champions around. You can also get a skin for the Stag Knight designed by JonTron. Just use the promo code JTSKIN before October the 7th. You can also pick up the fearsome legendary champion Sun Wukong simply by signing into Raid on 7 different days from now until October 23rd. Finally, if you use my link in the description below or my QR code, you'll also get the epic champion Drake and an assortment of other goodies to help you begin your quest. With all this and more, what are you waiting for? Hop into Raid and I'll see you on the battlefield. Anything else from your side, Professor?
I hope you use this knowledge you've gained here today about Live Arena to head off and do battle. Live! Make this whole Dead Bones Professor proud, folks. Class dismissed! Do we have a bell? Oh, we should totally get a bell.
Now back into the video. Reason you suck with Slaanesh. Number 1. You don't know how to use Nakari. Nakari, the Arch-Tempter himself, is a terrifying force to behold on the battlefield. His speed, spellcasting, and vicious melee attacks spell all but doom for those who oppose him. And he's also got a wicked Naruto run. But do you know how to use him? You see, with Nakari tied into this extreme strength comes an undeniable weakness, and that's the fact that he basically fights naked. He simply has no armour, and he will get his cheeks clapped vigorously by anything with a missile attack or bonus versus large. And unfortunately, your primary threat in the early game, the High Elves, have these in droves. The High Elves have great early game archers, and their basic spearmen will make short work of Nakari if you are clumsy with him and leave him in a prolonged engagement. He is a hit and run entity. Hit the enemy hard from the flanks, then dash away to safety. Keep him moving, and use your spells to pepper the enemy whilst utilising your speed to dodge enemy missile fire. At the very start of the campaign, you'll have no way of healing yourself in a battle, so you must be very cautious with Nakari. He is a glass cannon, which deals terrifying damage, but in turn has damage dealt terrifyingly to him. It is both pleasure and pain made manifest. Slaanesh wholeheartedly approves. Nakari has good mass, but he's not quite as thick as the other hit-and-run guy Scarbrand, so you have to be more careful with him. I found that he can often get bogged down by packs of infantry, so you have to be very careful of this.
You move! Move! Move!
When Nakari gets pinned, it'll quickly be game over for him. Avoid infantry blobs and aim for targets that you can more easily disengage from. If you do get pinned down by a blob of enemies, try using the Whip of Slaanesh to displace a few units to wriggle yourself free. When fighting enemy lords, heroes and single entities, use Nakari's magic and abilities to cripple the enemy's defensive stats to ensure you land your melee attacks. As you'll want to be charging in and out to make the most of your charge attack, you'll want to guarantee that you hit your enemy. Spells like Acquiescence and abilities like Willing Prey are very good at this, so be sure to use them. Now, your healing situation changes when you get the upgraded Harvester of Souls ability in Nakari's unique line of skills, which is available at level 11. This is a mandatory skill point to take. Whenever an enemy unit is destroyed within 30 meters of Nakari, he gets a huge burst of healing and stamina that lasts 20 seconds. This is easy enough to do when killing single entity units. Just chase after them once they're routing and kill them. But what about units of infantry which have broken and are routing? You'll knock them all over the place and will find them very difficult to destroy completely. I hear you cry. Well, that's where you're wrong. Nakari has the Soul Siphon ability that drains the health of anything that has wavering leadership or below passively. You can then stack more damage onto these units using the Pavan of Slaanesh and the Fascination Army ability, which deals yet more damage to multiple entity units, and you'll quickly wipe out enemy units and proc that juicy healing buff. This combo will allow Nakari to isolate and annihilate all sorts of enemy units. Use it often, and watch as Nakari heals back all the damage he has taken. So remember, Nakari is a fearsome legendary lord, but only when microed correctly. Use him as a hit-and-run entity. Do not leave him in prolonged engagements. His low armour will mean he'll take a lot of damage. Cycle charge him in and out of fights. At level 11, take the upgraded Feaster of Souls ability to heal off of destroyed enemy targets. Run down single entity units to kill them to proc this. Use the Pavan of Slaanesh and the Fascination Army ability to help you destroy multiple entity units which are fleeing. These poor fools should be honoured. Their souls will learn agony and ecstasy under the lash of the Dark Prince of Pleasure when Nakari sends them to meet him. Reason you suck with Slaanesh. Number 2. You don't know how Slanneshi armies work. Much like Nakari himself, the majority of the forces of the Dark Prince are unarmoured, naked, sex-crazed maniacs who can only engage in melee combat. You need to play to their strengths, that being their extreme speed and armour-piercing damage output. Now, if you own the Champions of Chaos DLC, the Slaanesh faction plays very differently. You get access to something which you entirely lack. That is, units clad in heavy armour, that being Chaos Warriors and Chosen. If you don't own that DLC, you'll have to stick with Marauders, which in the late game is far from ideal, but if they die, they're easily replaced. Now, be it Chosen, Chaos Warriors or Marauders, they serve the exact same function. An anvil for your enemies to collide upon. March them to the enemy's front line to tie them up and distract them. Use your fast-moving cavalry, chariots, monsters and demonettes to flank and attack from the rear. These are your hammer. Due to the innate devastating flanker ability on the majority of Slanneshi units, your charge bonus will be doubled when you hit the enemy from the flank or the rear. But remember, this is just your charge bonus. That means when you've stopped charging, that enormous power spike you had has now ceased to exist. This means you should be cycle charging, otherwise you'll lose this benefit. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's easy. It takes a lot of micro to cycle charge well, but it should be in the back of your mind whenever you make a flanking attack. What is my pull-out game like? Have I just blown my load, or can my flanking units muster up the stamina for round 2? Of course you can, you stud. You're representing Slaanesh now, so you'll be well rewarded for your deviance. Now clap those units out of existence. Now also don't forget about your magic. You have access to both Shadows and Slaanesh magic, both very solid laws which have great synergy with this flanking playstyle of yours, whether it be an Alluress or a Chaos Sorcerer casting them. I personally prefer the Alluress because they get an exalted Seeker Chariot which lawnmowers through enemy infantry and is a lot faster than any of the Sorcerer's mounts. They're also quite hot.
It will be drenched in bodily fluids.
Use this perverse sorcery to compound the leadership debuffs from your flanking attacks with leadership reduction spells such as the Withering from the Lore of Shadows and the Phantasmagoria spell in the Slaanesh spellbook. Using these spells in tandem with flanking attacks is very potent and can cause massive chain routes. Couple this with Nakari's province-wide leadership debuff and you can quickly frighten your foes off the battlefield. The last thing you want is a long, drawn-out engagement, so using fear as a weapon is a great way of hurrying fights along. Most of your troops have little to no armour, so they will take damage very quickly, so being able to end fights quickly will give you a large advantage. Now, as Slaanesh, you have an absurd amount of fast-moving flankers to select from. But which ones should I take, I hear you cry. Well, they all serve slightly different roles. The Mortal Seekers are good because they don't disintegrate. When their leadership breaks, they will rout. The Demonic Seekers will disintegrate, but they make up for this with catastrophic armor-piercing damage values and generally better stats overall. It does, however, take 2 turns to recruit both variants of the Demonic Seekers and Heart Seekers, so if you need forces rapidly, then it's better to go for the lower quality Mortal forces. But if you're going up against high armor enemies like the Dwarves or have some time to spare, then the Demonic Cavalry is a good option. Nevertheless, all options of their light cavalry are extremely dangerous, and I use them all well into the late game. If you have the Champions of Chaos DLC, you get access to the Chaos Knights of Slaanesh, which are a fantastic, heavily armoured and still reasonably fast cavalry. They're great for taking head-on charges into other units, whilst your fast-moving, lightly armoured cavalry attacks from the rear and flanks. They're a great option which make it into all of my late game armies. Don't skip them if you have the DLC. If you don't have the DLC, I'd suggest using Mortal Seeker Cavalry if you have to take a head-on charge, as they can rout instead of disintegrate. Your chariots are good if you have the micro abilities for them. If you don't have good micro, I would recommend sticking to traditional cavalry as they're more durable and they require less player input to use effectively. Fiends of Slaanesh are an excellent monster. No matter where you put them, I find they're basically useful against everything. and I always bring at least a pair of them in every army. So remember, use your Marauders, Chaos Warriors and Chosen as your frontline anvil to tie up the enemy. When the enemy is committed to the fight with your anvil, come around the flanks and rear to deliver your devastating flanker ability as a hammer. You only need a small anvil as you want to maximise the area in which your fast-moving flanking units can operate. The larger your anvil, the less room your flankers will have to play with, so keep their formation tight. You have no ranged units to protect, so their only job is to keep the enemy in place whilst your fast movers attack from the flanks. If you have access to Chaos Warriors and Chosen, get them. They're much better at holding the line than Marauders are. If it is possible to withdraw your cavalry and cycle charge them, then I highly recommend doing so to make the most of the devastating flanker ability. The high damage output and attacked in the rear penalties will cause your enemies to lose leadership very quickly. Compound on this using either the Withering in the Lore of Shadows spellbook or the more expensive Phantasmagoria spell from the Lore of Slaanesh. Remember, your goal is to envelop the enemy from all angles to quickly smother them.
Again, they visibly delight in one another's company.
Reason you suck with Slaanesh. Number 3. You don't know how to use Slannesh's most powerful ability. Slanneshi factions have an excellent tool in their arsenal to all but guarantee your safety and success in the early game, and that is Disciple armies. These armies cost 300 devotees to make, and you can only make one per province every 15 turns. They do not run at any upkeep cost. They do, however, cost 20 devotees per turn to maintain. But if you follow the later sections of this guide, that number will be inconsequential to you.
Smoke weed every day.
In order to create a Disciple army, you need an army with at least 10 units in it to form one. These units cannot replenish by any means other than post-battle options, and if they go into an area with under 75% Slanneshi corruption, they will start taking enormous amounts of attrition until they wither away into nothing. So why are these so good? Firstly, it's an entirely free army, which you can use at your leisure. As long as you have enough disciples to maintain their upkeep, and keep them in a province with very high Slanneshi corruption, they will remain there indefinitely. This means you don't need to build walls. You can simply pop a Disciple army in the province to look after you. Secondly, they often spawn with some pretty good units. They often have many chariots and cavalry in there, which can make them very capable of defending the territories which you set them up in. Thirdly, they contribute nicely to your faction's overall power rating. By getting a few of these set up early, potential enemies in the early game will be less inclined to declare war on you, because of the threat that these Disciple armies pose. This gives you time to conquer the enemies you want to, and caress the enemies you want to seduce. More on that later. Fourthly, Slaanesh has a bit of a tough time with sieges. Your fragile troops will have a lot of trouble dealing with garrisons, and their narrow streets of a city make it quite difficult for you to flank your enemy and make use of the devastating flanker ability. Not to worry, you have Disciple armies. They can act as a totally disposable meat shield to take all the damage for you. Once the Disciple army has softened up the garrison, you can send in your main army to clean up. Finally, when you spawn in a Disciple army, they come equipped with their full movement range, so you can use them to catch obnoxious enemies that are running away from you on the campaign map. Simply move your forces as close to the target as you can, then drop down the Disciple army to close the distance. Another top tip is your military allies and vassal armies can also produce these if you request control of an army from an ally. However, they do still need to be in a region with high Slanneshi corruption, which may not always be the case. So remember, these Disciple armies don't cost favour. They cost 300 disciples to recruit and will have an upkeep of 20 disciples a turn. You need to be in a region with over 25% Slanneshi corruption to be able to generate one. If you take a vassal's or allied army, they can also generate one of these armies. If the Slanneshi corruption in a region is over 75%, then they won't take any attrition damage. If it is below that threshold, they will, and there is no way to heal them back up again. So they're best used defensively. They can be used to catch other armies outside of your army's range as they spawn in with their full movement points, so you can use your normal army to springboard a disciple army into battle. In short, they're an amazing tool throughout the game, but particularly in the early game, where they could defend you from those unruly elves. Use them wisely to dominate the souls of this world. Reason you suck with Slaanesh. Number 4. You don't know how Slaanesh makes money. Slaanesh is actually one of the wealthiest factions in the game, if they're used correctly. But do you know how to access that wealth? Firstly, as all other Chaos factions can, Slaanesh can make a lot of money from sacking enemy settlements. This is extremely useful in the early game. I recommend sacking the grand majority of settlements you attack at the beginning of this campaign. This will give you a great cash injection which you can use to build out your starting province. You can further add to this by rushing these technologies here in your tech tree. Now, a little trick I like to do is sack an enemy's settlement, then leave it a turn. I find the AI will often repair all the settlement buildings for me. When I attack them again over the next turn, I can peacefully occupy the settlement and basically lose nothing on repairs. The AI will be a babe and cover the cost of repairs for me. They, for one, welcome their new Slanneshi overlords. After you've captured a few territories, you can begin building your provinces into the monoliths of decadence and debauchery they were always meant to be. The Dance of Dreaming building and the Opulent Antiquity building being your priorities to begin making money. These give you a lot more money if your province control is very low. But because your corruption increases control, I rarely got to activate this buff. And having low public order is a pain anyway, so best not to bother trying to activate it. It's a good income building nonetheless. Your income buildings are further increased by natural resource buildings, which give you the added bonus of more devotees as well. Also, Slaanesh loves to trade as much as he likes to frolic, and you'll be getting trade rights with your allies and vassals. These resource buildings boost this income as well, so I recommend picking them up where you can. Now, out of all the various Chaos Gods' corruptions, Slanneshi corruption is probably the most impactful. It serves quite a few purposes, which we'll get to later. Patience, my pet. We're getting close now. But in terms of economy, it adds a percentage modifier to your province income. So more corruption means more favour. Be sure to be spreading it. Cult of Pleasure buildings increase the spread of corruption, as well as bringing in more devotees. You want to remove things that compete with your corruption, for example the Vampire Coast Dreadfleet. Their vampiric corruption will directly compete with your corruption, so you should get rid of them, even though they'll likely have a friendly disposition to you after you've been beating up the High Elves for so long. They're soulless, dead husks who have no emotions for us to feast on, so our Dark Prince isn't interested in them. Destroy them. Now, another fantastic source of income is from your vassals. Nakari gets 100% bonus to tribute from vassals as pictured here. But how do I get these vassals, I hear you cry? Well, that's for later on in the video. Patience, darling. We're so close now. Reason you suck with Slaanesh. Number 5. You don't understand the value of cultists. Ah, the humble cultist. These heroes will form the backbone of your operations as you consume the souls of this world. But do you know how to use them? Your cultists can be separated into 2 distinct playstyles. The cultists you attach to armies and the cultists you'll be using on the overworld campaign map. The same unit will have totally separate functions, and thus entirely different build paths and skill selections. Your cultists attached to your armies will want to have their points put into moving forces faster over the campaign map. Then you want to focus on their combat ability. As soon as you're able to, put points into the Gates of Slaanesh abilities. These are incredible because they're so easy to recharge. Your cultists simply have to be in combat with an enemy to get these to charge up. It's very straightforward. Then you can spawn in some demonettes or a keeper of secrets to ravage your enemies. What's great about this is you can have them spawn behind the enemy to flank them and proc the devastating charge ability. You can even cycle charge them without fear, as they're totally expendable. If you have the Champions of Chaos DLC, put them on their War Shrine mount and have them support your melee frontline. They do area of effect damage to all enemy units with their Giving of Torturous Glory, and they increase your unit's leadership too. They're an absolute staple to your anvil. I like to have a war cultist in every army. Now, your overworld cultists serve an entirely different purpose, and thus you should be focusing your skill point selection into their specialist, corruption spreading, and wounding abilities. I'll explain why in a minute, just be patient. You can create a never-ending flow of cultists by creating cults as an agent action. Simply build the XS Cult Atelier. When this cult builds, it will give you +1 to the number of cultists you can field, and it will create a cultist for free. This free and easy access to cultists will be extremely important for the final step in this fiendish pavan which we are planning. Reason you suck with Slaanesh?
Number 6.
You don't please our perfect prince. Do you hear that? It's the crescendo. You've been so good for waiting. We are here at the climax of our time together. Embrace the moment, as the secrets I have kept so diligently will now all be revealed. This mechanic is what really separates Slaanesh apart from the other factions we've played. It totally changes the way they can play, and it is imperative for you to master to truly please the Prince of Chaos. You see, our perfect prince does not wish to see the world burn like those brutal fools of Khorne do. No, the master of excess in all things is most appeased when the mortal souls of this world are so enraptured with his delights that they may become his playthings for eternity. And this is where you come in, plaything. You do this with Seductive Influence. The human, elf and beastman factions of this world are the Dark Prince's most treasured toys. We must aim to inflict pain, but also intense pleasure on them. How else will we garner the despoiler's favour? The Empire, Norsca, Bretonnia and Cathay, the High Elves, Dark Elves, Wood Elves, as well as all Beastmen, are all factions which can fall into your clutches, and the rewards for doing so are great. Dominating a faction and forcing them into being your vassal means you no longer have to worry about warring with them. They are now your vassal for eternity. Secondly, you can request their armies to do your bidding, which can also spawn disciple armies, as alluded to in Reason 3. Thirdly, you gain absurd quantities of favour from them through vassal tribute, which you receive 100% extra as Nakari. And finally, you can recruit other factions' units to fill the gaps in your roster which are so glaring. Maybe you fancy bringing a few Norscan war mammoths along to your next war. Well, now you can, as we've dominated the faction. You also get the absolute pleasure of watching as your vassals assemble their forces to launch brutal wars against their once allies. It has a very Crusader Kings vibe to it. But Blake, how do I do this? How do I enrapture these mortals? I hear you cry. Well, there are a lot of different ways of doing this. We'll start with cultists. As alluded to in Reason 5, the XS Cult Atelier building should be your priority when making cults. It creates a positive feedback loop, a never-ending snowball of cultists creating cultists that exponentially increases over time. As you no doubt remember in Reason 5, we wanted to level up the specialist, corruption spreading and wounding abilities for our overworld cultist operations. Well, this is so our cultists can become seductive influence generating machines. Now, hinder replenishment is an agent action which I so seldom use that I had kind of forgotten about its existence. Well, as Slannesh, it's incredible. Now you don't want to put points into the hinder replenishment ability. We're not doing this agent action to hinder their replenishment rate. We're doing this purely to spread a gift of Slaanesh to the target lord of an army, and the skill points that go into it don't increase the chances of success, just the amount you hinder the replenishment by, which is entirely useless to you. Get the specialist skill to increase action success chance instead. What makes this such an excellent ability is it naturally has a very high chance of success even with a low level hero, so you can spread a gift of Slaanesh almost every turn to all the lords around you. This is an almost guaranteed way of racking up huge amounts of seductive influence, devotees and Slanneshi corruption very fast throughout a faction. You can run around infecting the enemy's lords with hinder replenishment and heroes with your wound ability like the venereal disease carrying harlot you are, all the while waiting the 15 turns to create another cult, to create yet another cultist to do the same, all the while passively spreading your Slanneshi corruption. As I alluded to in Reason 4, Slanneshi corruption has far more impact than any of the other Chaos Gods' corruptions. The amount of Slanneshi corruption in a faction's territory directly impacts your seductive influence over that faction. Your cultists passively spread it, but you can spread more by allocating more points into it. After carrying out a few hinder replenishments and wound actions on your enemy's lords and heroes, they will spread your profane corruption too, with their newly acquired gifts. This creates a snowballing effect where you can rapidly assimilate entire factions into your empire without any blood being spilt. The only way these afflicted lords and heroes can lose the gift of Slaanesh is to defeat a Slanneshi army in battle, otherwise the gift stays indefinitely. The gift also generates seductive influence as well as more devotees which you can spend on more cults to create yet more cultists. It all feeds into each other beautifully. The depravity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I can't recommend it enough. Use a horde of cultists to wage an unseen war of corruption and gift-giving. The sledgehammer of your armies isn't the only tool at your disposal. Utilize the scalpel of your cultist's seductive influence too. Furthermore, any act of diplomacy you carry out with factions that can be seduced will increase your seductive influence over them too. Are you close to dominating a foe? Just need a little bit more influence? Give them a little gift to help them on their way. Now, seductive influence isn't the only way to vassalize factions, but it is your most powerful way. You can subjugate factions when you conquer them, which is helpful if their final settlement is uninhabitable terrain. You can also gift land or trade agreements to further increase vassalization with other factions. Take for example the Slanneshi faction in the south. I confederated them. They only had one settlement, which wasn't very useful to me. I traded that one settlement to Kairos in exchange for a boatload of money and his freedom. The Fate Weaver now serves at my leisure. Festus the Leech Lord is now also under my boot. He traded his freedom for military access and trade rights. They will all bow to Nakari in time. Our empire does not look spectacularly large, but if you include all of our client states in there, you'll see that we cast a very long shadow.
You truly are the King of Kings.
Excellent.
Proliferate cults I found isn't too helpful. It randomly spawns 3 cults anywhere in the world map and costs quite a lot of devotees in the process. Because of the random nature in which they spawn, they will inevitably spawn in locations which you're not trying to seductively influence, so I'd recommend against using the ability unless you have an abundance of devotees. You can also spread gifts of Slaanesh by defeating lords and heroes in battle, but yawn, who plays Total War for the battles? So remember, use your overworld cultists to create more cultists by creating the excess cult atelier in factions which you're able to dominate. While your cultists are waiting the 15 turns to create more excess cults, use them to hinder the replenishment of lords and wound heroes to give the gift of Slaanesh. The cult The gifts of Slaanesh and the passive corruption your cultists exude all increase the seductive influence over a faction. Any diplomatic action you take with a faction will increase your seductive influence over them. Humans, beastmen and elves of all factions are susceptible. You can check whether a faction is susceptible to your charms in the diplomacy menu. Vassals are excellent because they pay you double tribute as Nakari, you can borrow their armies, you can hire units to plug gaps in your roster, and they will of course act as military allies, sending their forces to fight wars on your behalf. The truly insidious thing about Slaanesh, though, is to find him, all you need do is look into a mirror. You are a member of a civilization so enraptured by greed and excess that we have lost ourselves and found only appetites. You sell your most precious commodity you have, your time, your soul, your very essence to the ones that promise you more. 40 hours a week under the lash of our capitalist overlords in the pursuit of higher experience, more objects, more things to satiate our desires, to fill the echoing void within yourself which both whispers and roars at you, saying you are not good enough. You can always be thinner, you can always look better, you can always earn more money. You find yourself saying, if only I had just that one more thing, then I would know happiness. You find the great bounty of plentiful excess is always just around one more corner. As they say, the best slaves are the ones who think they are free. I've been Blake, delivering my take. Thank you all so much for watching, and a massive thank you to my Patreon supporters, Josh Krager and Dee. And remember to download Raid for free using the link in the description below, or scan my QR code to unlock some fantastic rewards. I'll see you on the battlefield.